We are going to show you very simple and easy to implement tips and changes that will have an immediate impact on the presentation and demonstration you deliver. And for this, we actually go back to the sales process steps that we discussed in a previous video. And before I talk to you about what I recommend you do, let's start out by discussing what not to do and what I believe a lot of salespeople do. And that is that our close at the initial contact step might be to try to schedule the prospect for the demonstration, or the prospect at the initial contact step may ask us for a demo. And when that happens, we're skipping ahead in the sales process steps, and that could have a negative impact on the demonstration that we deliver. So you may be able to see where I'm going with this, but I personally believe the conversation sales process step is the key to an awesome demonstration. The conversation step is where we're going to be able to learn about the prospect, and we can make the demonstration more about the prospect, and that will take your demonstrations and your presentations to a whole nother level. And so just to show you how all of that comes together in terms of an appointment script, here are some questions that you can open your meeting with. I won't go through these. I've gone through these in other videos, but if you want to download these slides, these are good questions to open the meeting with. But then right away in the appointment, I like to start out by learning what's going on with the prospect in terms of the area where I have software to sell. And your current state questions fit very nicely here. And these questions alone may give you the information you need to provide a tailored demonstration, and also to identify why the prospect might need your software or benefit from your software. But if you don't get everything you need with the current state questions, you could ask your pain questions. And if these help you to uncover challenges that the prospect's having that your software can be the solution for, then what you find out here will help you to deliver a much more powerful demonstration. And so hopefully, if I just stopped right here, you should be able to see how this process can transform your demonstration. Because if you skip ahead and you don't go through this conversation step where you're learning about the prospect, what you are doing is you are likely delivering a standard demonstration where you're just showing the features and the functionality of your software. When you gather this information about the prospect, you can tailor everything you show to exactly what the prospect is having challenges with. If your questions don't uncover pain points, you could maybe share with them the common pain points that your software can help with to see if that helps to uncover anything. Then you start to get to the second half of the meeting and the conversation, and this is where you can start to talk about you. Now, if the prospect is asking for a demonstration, you might not need to talk too much about you because they're already interested. But if the topic of the demonstration hasn't come up yet and you're trying to prepare for that close, this is where you want to start to introduce your product and software as a solution to the prospect's needs that you've already discussed. And you can just stay at a high level because you're going to get into the details in the next sales process step, which is the explanation step, and that's where you provide your demonstration and presentation. Right after you talk about your company and product is a great place for you to introduce a customer example if you want to just build a little bit more interest before you go for the close. The conversation and the meeting sales process step is your real opportunity to learn about the prospect, and this is probably one of the best places for you to qualify the prospect. And we talked about qualifying in a previous video where we're trying to figure out how strong or weak the prospect is in these 4 areas. And it's the bottom part of the second half of the meeting where you might want to start to ask some of these questions. And finding out more details in these areas will help you to determine how qualified the prospect is. And this will be really valuable information regarding your demonstration, because if the prospect is extremely qualified, then you're justified spending a lot of time in preparing for the demonstration, delivering the presentation, maybe traveling for the demonstration. But if you ask some of these questions and you find out that the prospect's interested, but they're not real qualified and they might be weak in some of these areas, then you can make some decisions regarding how much time you spend on this demonstration. You might become very guarded and just provide a very minimal demonstration. Or you might even find out that the prospect is not a fit for what you sell, and you may reach a point where you suggest to the prospect that it doesn't make sense for either of you to spend your valuable time in a demonstration because they don't fit well with what you sell. Now, if you recall in the previous video on gathering information, there's a lot of questions that we can ask in these categories, and you might be running out of time when you get to this place in the conversation sales process step. So you may start to view these qualifying questions as more of a discovery, where right before you start your preparation for the demonstration, you want to perform more of a sales discovery, learning more about the prospect and asking those qualifying questions. There may be other categories of questions that you want to ask the prospect about in order to provide a very thorough demonstration. And so if you want to perform some sort of sales discovery, you could do that in the bottom half of the conversation step. But if you have a lot of questions to ask, you may want to break that out as another step. So towards the end of your appointment, your first meeting with the prospect, you may want to close them on a follow-up meeting where you're going to spend 30 to 60 minutes asking some questions and learning more about them before you deliver your presentation. But just to show you what this qualifying step would look like, you could ask your need to purchase questions, ability to purchase questions, authority to purchase questions, intent to purchase questions, and we discussed all those questions in a previous video in this series. After you've qualified the prospect and you've identified it still makes sense to keep moving forward, this is where you would want to close the prospect on the next step of your sales process, which would be the explanation. This is where you would close the prospect on the demonstration. Now, I just want to point out that you may look at these steps and feel like you don't want to take the prospect through another step prior to the demonstration. You can mix and match these steps in different ways. For example, you could have that conversation step at the same time as the initial contact. Say you're talking to a prospect for the first time on an inbound call, maybe they're asking for a demo, and you want to schedule that demo as the next step. You could go through the conversation sales process at the same time while you're on the phone with the prospect. You could just say, great, let's meet next week for the demo, but in order to prepare for that, I just want to ask you a few questions, and that's where you can ask some of your current state questions, pain questions, maybe hopefully some of your qualifying questions. And I would refer to that as an instant meeting. We're basically meeting at the same time as the initial contact. You could also mix and match those steps to have what I refer to as the instant explanation. And this would basically be where you have the conversation right before delivering your demonstration. You might be scheduling the demonstration as your first close, as the next step when you first get engaged with a prospect. And what you could do is you could then just add that conversation step to the front end of that meeting right before you show the demo. But now let's get to the actual demonstration, and that takes place in the explanation step of the sales process. When you just jump to the demo and you don't have a lot of information about the prospect and you just show your standard demonstration, your demonstration would typically be about 100% on the company and the product. But when you learn more about the prospect, what you could do is you could make 20% of this meeting and what you talk about the prospect and 80% on you, and that can have a huge impact. And let me show you what that can look like from a flow standpoint. So meeting opening, meeting warm-up questions. And then right after we open the meeting, we can start out by talking about the prospect. And this is where we can present a summary of our findings. What you could do is you can show the prospect what you learned about them by asking your pain questions and current state questions. And this can make a great impression. It can let the prospect know that you've been listening to what they've been saying. It can make the prospect feel understood. And this also gives you an opportunity to check in with the prospect to make sure you're correct with all of your findings. And either they can validate and confirm what you've just presented to them, or you may get them to uncover more information by adding anything to this list that you might have missed. Then you can transition to talking about you. And before we talk about the solution, we can focus on our value points of the software that we sell and present the improvements that we can make. And maybe connect this to the pain points and problems that the prospect is having. And so after you outline the improvements that your software can deliver, then it's about explaining and demonstrating how you deliver those improvements. And this is where you talk about your product, your software, and company. And I can't tell you exactly how to organize that, but this is the part of the presentation demonstration where you're showing the product, and the more you can tailor that to the exact needs of the prospect and what the prospect has asked for, the better impression you will make and the more interest that you will build. And a nice thing to share at the end of the presentation is an example of where you've done this before. If you've just outlined the prospect's problems and how you can solve those problems, a great thing to end with is sharing an example of another customer or another business that had those same problems and how you helped to solve those problems. Not only does this help to build interest, it can help to explain and paint a picture for what your software does if it's not completely clear up already at this point. And this can also help you to establish credibility by showing success and history of where you've done this before. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully that gives you some really easy to implement ideas for how to organize your demonstrations and take that to the next level. And after your demonstration is when it's time to close the prospect on moving forward, and that's what we'll talk about in the next video.